So, if I told you to design a system to test whether a massive suspension bridge was going to collapse, what would you do?
I mean, I probably load it up with concrete blocks, right? Or like drive a fleet of semi-trucks over it to measure the tensile stress on the steel cables.
Right, exactly. You'd use physics, you'd use math. But if I asked you to test whether a human society was going to collapse,
Oh, that's where things get weird.
yeah, people would probably start talking about, morality or theology or like some mysterious divine plan.
Which is exactly where our analytical brains just completely shut down. I mean, we treat engineering as a science and we treat civilizational survival as, well, basically a fairy tale.
Right. And today, we're looking at an ancient text that says you are completely wrong to separate those two things. It says societies are bridges.
Yes.
And the systemic pressures of life like famine, war, economic collapse, that is the concrete.
It's a phenomenal paradigm shift, really.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are taking a really ruthless, highly analytical look at an ancient text, specifically Surah Al-Ankabut, verses 2 through 7.
And we should clarify, we are not looking at this as a religious sermon at all.
Exactly. We are completely stripping away the theological sentimentality. I mean, we're not taking sides on personal religious beliefs here.
No, we're treating this text exactly as it presents itself, which is a structural blueprint for civilizational survival.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the moment you strip away that mystical overlay, you realize you're reading like a manual for operational resilience.
It really is. It's pure systems engineering applied to sociology.
Which brings us to the core myth we have to explode right out of the gate. Thousands of years of human culture basically rely on this deeply sentimental idea of existential testing.
Right. The victimization mindset.
Yeah. A society faces a drought or an individual faces a horrific loss, and the default response is, well, it's a test from the heavens.
Right. And people usually interpret that in one of two ways, don't they?
Exactly. Either as arbitrary cruelty like, I don't know, a kid burning ants with a magnifying glass just to watch them squirm, or it's some deeply mystical trial.
Like you just have to suffer through it in silence to earn spiritual points.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a deeply passive framework. I mean, it assumes the overarching system, whether you want to call it God, the universe, the laws of nature, is just throwing random hurdles at you for fun.
But this text lands a completely different, almost aggressive thesis.
It really does. It starts right in verses 2 and 3 with this massive rhetorical question. It asks, do people think they will be left to say, we believe, and not be tested? We tested those before them.
So basically it's saying, you think you can just talk. You think words are enough.
Exactly. The Arabic word used there for testing is yuftanun.
Yuftanun.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll dig into the intense physical meaning of that word in a minute. But just fundamentally, this completely reframes the concept of a trial.
How so?
Well, it's not a punishment. It's a socioeconomic selection mechanism.
A selection mechanism. Okay, wait, explain that.
Think about what the phrase "we believe" actually represents in the context of a system.
I mean, it's an assertion. Like if I say, I believe in this country's constitution or I am committed to justice, I haven't actually done anything yet. I'm just talking.
Right. You have provided unverified data. That is all a claim of belief is.
Unverified data. I like that.
Yeah, it's an input that hasn't been checked against reality. And a functional system, it cannot process an unverified claim as an operational reality.
Oh, wow.
Until stress is applied to that claim, you simply do not know if the structure is load-bearing.
So it really is like structural engineering.
Right.
Or even software development, right?
Exactly like that.
Like a programmer writes a massive new piece of code for an aviation autopilot system. They don't just stand up from their keyboard, say, I believe this code is flawless, and then instantly deploy it to 1,000 commercial jetliners.
If they did, it would be catastrophic malpractice. The system would just reject it.
Right. They run a stress test. They simulate massive turbulence. They throw corrupted data at the sensors. They push the code to the absolute brink.
Yes. And they aren't doing that because they're angry at the software.
No.
They don't apply thousands of simulated flight hours of pressure to punish the code?
Right. They do it to verify its operational capacity. I mean, you have to know objectively what the breaking point is.
And what's fascinating here is how this completely strips away the emotional baggage we attach to our own trials.
Yeah, the text is essentially telling us that fitna, the test, the environmental pressure, is the system distinguishing a genuine operational commitment from a cheap verbal assertion.
A cheap verbal assertion. Man, we are drowning in those today, aren't we?
Oh, entirely. It feels like modern society is built entirely on unverified data. Like everyone online says they believe in equity or resilience or sacrifice.
But the universe doesn't read your social media bio. The system only cares what you can withstand. The claim is nothing more than a hypothesis. The friction of reality is the experiment that proves or disproves it.
And remember, we're talking about civilizational mechanics here. Like, for you listening, think about it on a macro scale.
Right. If an empire claims to be built on justice, but the moment the supply chains break down, it abandons its vulnerable populations to hoard resources for the elite.
Then the initial claim of "we believe in justice" was statistically false.
Exactly. The test just revealed the actual structural composition.
Which makes me want to dive into the vocabulary here, because you mentioned the Arabic word yuftanun, which comes from fitna.
Yes, fitna.
And usually when I hear fitna translated today, it's broadly used to mean like a tribulation or a temptation or even a punishment.
Yeah.
But the roots of this word aren't ethereal at all, are they?
No, not at all. It's shockingly physical.
Okay, tell me about that.
This is where the systems engineering approach really locks in. The root of the word fitna is derived from metallurgy.
Metallurgy. Really?
Yeah. Specifically, it refers to the process of assaying metal.
Assaying. Like smelting raw ore.
Exactly. Taking raw, unrefined metal like gold or iron ore you just pulled out of the earth and throwing it into a literal furnace.
Right.
You subject it to intense, sustained, blistering fire.
And the purpose of the fire isn't to destroy the gold, obviously.
No, the fire cannot destroy the core element. The purpose is to melt the mass down so that the pure element separates from the dross.
The dross being the impurities.
Right, the weaker minerals, the dirt mixed into the ore. The fire burns away what is useless and tempers the core element.
The metallurgical purification process that turns brittle iron into hardened steel.
Exactly. So when this ancient text applies the word fitna to humanity, to individuals or entire civilizations, it is deliberately using a metallurgical metaphor.
So the societal heat, the economic friction, the political turmoil, that is the fire.
Yes, and it's applied to reveal the actual composition of the group. It is the crucible.
Because, and this is so true, here's the thing about a society in a state of prolonged comfort. The pure metal and the dross are completely indistinguishable.
Oh, that is fascinating.
Right. When times are good, everyone looks solid.
Everyone looks the same. Everyone sounds the same. The opportunist and the genuine builder are standing shoulder to shoulder.
Exactly. Everyone says, "we believe," and everyone looks like a load-bearing pillar.
But apply the fire, introduce a sudden scarcity of resources, a war, an economic depression, and the systemic thermodynamics take over.
The impurities melt.
Right. The cowards flee. The corrupt hoard. The dross burns away, and only the actual load-bearing elements remain standing.
So the phrase "amana, we believe," that is just the raw ore being brought to the forge.
Yeah, you hold it up and declare, "This is solid gold," and the system simply responds, "We will see." The fire is the verification.
And notice how devoid of emotion that process is.
Oh, completely. Fire does not feel malice toward the ore.
Right, it just operates according to the laws of physics.
Yeah.
Similarly, the systemic trials of life aren't malicious. They are just the sociological laws of the universe processing a claim. But wait, hold on. I'm stuck on something here.
What is it?
If we're treating this as a universal system, and the system operator, God, the architect, whatever we are calling it, is omniscient,
Yeah.
then the test seems completely redundant.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Right. Like a structural engineer tests a bridge because human math is fallible. He doesn't know for sure if it will hold. But if God already knows the exact composition of the ore, why run the simulation at all?
Right?
Why turn on the furnace if you already know it's pure?
That gets to the absolute core of how this framework views human existence. And the text anticipates that exact question.
Really? It does.
Yeah, it answers it by referencing verse 6 of the same chapter. It says, "Whoever strives, strives only for himself."
Interesting.
The Arabic phrase there is li nafsihi, for his own self. And the word for striving is jahada.
Li nafsihi. So the effort is entirely self-referential.
Completely.
Yeah.
The text is explaining that the test is not for the system operator to gather information. The omniscient system does not need to learn the outcome. The test is run for the agent to realize their own capacity.
Oh, wow. So I am not putting on a performance for an audience in the sky. I am not proving something to God.
No, you are proving it to yourself.
That makes so much sense.
Look at biology, right? Evolution and adaptation only happen through friction.
Yeah,
If you want to build physical strength, you can't just visualize lifting weights.
right. You can't just think about it really hard.
Exactly. And the universe cannot magically bestow muscle mass upon you without violating its own biological laws.
Yeah, you have to subject the muscle tissue to actual stress. You have to create microtears in the fibers. The friction is what signals the body to build more capacity.
Exactly. The effort of the test is what actualizes the potential of the agent.
Wow.
If the omniscient system just looked at you and declared, you possess immense strength, but you never faced a trial, you'd have no empirical realization of that strength.
You would be living in an illusion. The test forces the agent to confront their own empirical reality.
Exactly. It kills the potential for self-deception.
Because if we never face adversity, we can wander through life assuming we are incredibly brave or resilient or generous when we are actually none of those things.
Right. The test is the mirror of reality. It tells you exactly how much kinetic energy you actually possess.
It shifts the human from being a passive victim of a divine whim into an active participant in their own evolutionary assaying process.
Which means an unverified belief is basically useless.
Completely useless.
Yeah, if we take this epistemology, this way of knowing what is true, and apply it to action, it changes everything.
It really does. It means an unverified belief is practically a zero in the mathematical equation of reality.
Actually, it's worse than a zero. It's a false positive.
Wait, what do you mean by a false positive?
Well, in systems engineering, if you have a variable in your structural code that you assume is stable, but it hasn't actually been tested under load, that is exactly where your system will experience catastrophic failure. You build other structures on top of it, trusting it, and when the load hits, it shatters and takes everything else down with it.
Because you assumed it was solid.
Exactly. Only a tested commitment can predict behavior under load.
So essentially, thoughts and prayers are uncompiled code.
Yes.
They don't execute in reality.
Yes.
The system literally cannot compute a belief until someone acts on it.
Yes. The Surah is demanding absolute empirical evidence. It refuses to take "we believe" at face value.
Which makes sense.
And the irony is, we apply this rational demand for evidence everywhere else in our functional lives.
Oh, we definitely do.
Yeah.
Like if someone walks up to me and says, I believe I am a master surgeon, I don't just hand them a scalpel and lay down on the operating table based on their deep internal conviction.
No, of course not.
I demand to see their medical degree. I want to see their residency hours. I want the empirical evidence of their tested commitment.
Exactly. But for some reason, when it comes to the fundamental values of a society, our morality, our civilizational integrity, we suddenly abandon empiricism.
We accept cheap assertions.
Right. And the text is demanding that we apply the exact same rigorous empirical demand for evidence to our sociological claims. Action is the only proof of belief.
There is a brilliant analogy in the source material that really grounds this. It uses the concept of citizenship or nationality.
Oh, yeah, that's a great section.
Let's walk through that
Yeah.
for you listening, because it moves this from an abstract philosophy into cold, hard logistics.
Absolutely. Think about what it means to claim a nationality. Suppose you say, I believe in this nation, and you take the passport.
Yeah.
That is not just waving a flag or feeling patriotic during a football game.
Right.
Accepting the nationality means you accept the entire operational matrix of that state.
Yeah, you are opting into a specific set of socioeconomic obligations. You
Yeah.
accept the Constitution, the tax codes, the traffic laws, property rights.
You can't just take the passport and say, well, I believe in the beautiful idea of this country, but I'm going to completely ignore the tax laws. I'm going to drive on the wrong side of the road, and I am going to seize my neighbor's house.
If you do that, the state doesn't care how passionately you sing the national anthem.
No, it doesn't.
You face the system's penalties.
Right. The state cares about your functional adherence to its operational laws. If you break the laws, the system reacts. You are fined or imprisoned.
So applying that analogy to the universal system described in this text, claiming we believe
Yes.
is taking the citizenship of the universal system.
Yes.
You are opting into the operational laws of the universe. It doesn't mean you just like sit back in a mystical trance and wait for blessings.
No, it means you are now legally bound by the socioeconomic and moral constitution of that system.
And this is where the text highlights the supreme, almost comical arrogance of those who think they can cheat that system.
Oh, yeah. Verse 4.
Right. It references verse 4.
Mhm.
Do those who do evil think they can outrun us?
The illusion of outrunning consequences. It is the ultimate systemic delusion.
Yeah.
The text points out that corrupt individuals or corrupt societies are running on a fundamentally illogical assertion. They are operating on the assumption that systemic consequences won't catch up to them.
Right.
They think they can inject corrupted code into the system by exploiting workers, hoarding wealth, creating massive class imbalance, and somehow escape the inevitable crash.
It's like a corporate embezzler cooking the books for years, fully acting on the unverified belief that an audit will never, ever happen.
Exactly.
They're banking on the delusion that the laws of mathematics will somehow suspend themselves just for their benefit.
And the text is saying, you think you can outrun the system. The system is absolute.
It's the tyranny of unproven assertions.
Yes. And when an entire civilization begins to operate on the unproven assertion that they can generate massive internal imbalance without facing a consequence, that is when the countdown to collapse begins.
Because the assaying fire is coming.
Right. And they have no pure metal to withstand it.
Okay, so if an unverified assertion leads to systemic failure, do we have empirical proof of this happening to a whole civilization?
Oh, definitely.
Because the source material actually uses a massive historical clash to prove this system in action.
It does. The confrontation between the ancient Arabs and the Persian Empire.
Yeah, let's look at this historical stress test.
It is a phenomenal case study of what happens when a society built on unverified assumptions collides with a kinetic force aligned with operational reality.
Okay, set the stage for us.
So let's set the stage. The Sassanid Persian Empire was a colossal superpower.
Right, they had a 1,000-year-old civilization.
Entrenched bureaucracy, immense wealth, standing armies, and a highly stratified class system. They had the sheer inertia of history on their side.
And how do they view the Arabs at the time?
With absolute, unvarnished contempt.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The historical records reflect that the Persians didn't even consider the Arabs a military threat. They considered them a geopolitical nuisance. They looked at these nomadic tribespeople with no central infrastructure, drinking camel milk, living in the harsh desert, and thought it was beneath the dignity of the Persian military machine to even engage them in formal warfare.
The arrogance was staggering. I mean, the source mentions the Persian commander, Rostam.
Right, Rostam.
When the Arab envoys arrived, he essentially laughed at them. The psychological state of the Persian elite was pure hubris.
They were operating on the unverified assumption of permanent supremacy.
Exactly. They believed their past success somehow guaranteed their future survival, entirely ignoring their current structural rot.
And the structural rot within the Persian system was profound. It was incredibly top-heavy.
Explain that.
Well, they had these rigid castes, the Mobads, the Dekwans. There was a massive disconnect between the ultra-wealthy elite and the baseline reality of the populace who were just crushed by taxation.
So they were a society filled with dross.
Yes. It was a hollow structure with a beautiful 1,000-year-old facade.
But then the clash happens.
The clash happens, the fire is applied.
The test of the battlefield. The Arabs triumph. The 1,000-year empire is completely dismantled.
Right.
So from a systems engineering perspective, why exactly did this happen?
Well, the text is adamant that it wasn't magic. It wasn't a mystical intervention where God threw lightning bolts from the sky to smite the Persians.
Right.
It happened because one group, at that highly specific moment in history, had aligned themselves with the operational laws of the universe.
They had aligned with the system of equilibrium.
Yes, meaning they had removed their internal class imbalances.
They had stripped away the tribal fragmentations and the socio-economic rot.
Right. They were lean. They were lean and they were load-bearing. They had become pure tempered steel.
Meanwhile, the Persian Empire was weighed down by fatal class imbalances.
The physics of it are simple. When a hollow structure collides with a solid, load-bearing object, the hollow structure shatters.
Wow.
The laws of sociology and physics dictated the outcome, not magic.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This brings up one of the most brilliant metaphors in the source text.
Oh, the poetry.
Yeah, it references the poetry of Ghalib and Iqbal to explain how this divine or universal system actually operates through human history, the metaphor of the arrow and the quiver.
Yes. It is a stunning mechanical breakdown of determinism versus human agency.
Right. The idea is that the arrows of destiny, like the inevitable consequences of the universal system, the forces that dismantle corrupt empires, are always resting in the quiver of the universe.
Exactly. The potential energy for justice and equilibrium always exists.
But, and this is the crux of the whole philosophy, The system's arrow does not fire itself.
No, it doesn't.
The bow does not magically draw itself back in the sky.
Right. Potential energy remains potential energy until a human hand draws the bowstring.
Yep.
The laws of civilizational consequence do not execute themselves in a vacuum. They require human agents to execute the physical mechanics.
The divine system doesn't step out of the clouds to fight your battles for you. The arrows of systemic correction only fly when a group of human beings act as the bow.
Exactly. And the Arabs, in that specific historical moment, became the bow. They executed the mechanics.
Which completely vaporizes the passive, waiting for a savior mentality that cripples so many societies.
It really does. You cannot sit back as a victim and say, well, the system will eventually correct itself, or God will eventually handle these oppressors.
Because the quiver is soul. But if no human hand reaches back, grabs the arrow of consequence, and provides the kinetic energy.
Through actual sacrifice, effort, and verified commitment, that jihad we discussed.
Right, if you don't do that, then the arrow just stays in the quiver forever.
It is a joint operation. The universal system provides the infallible laws of trajectory, gravity, and impact.
But the human being must provide the velocity.
If you want a result, you have to initiate the operational sequence.
But to initiate that sequence correctly, the human agents must themselves be internally balanced.
Yes, you cannot be a warped, corrupted bow and expect to fire a straight arrow.
Which transitions us perfectly from the battlefield into the marketplace.
Yes, let's look at the internal mechanics required by the system.
The socio-economic equilibrium.
This is where the text becomes incredibly radical.
It really does.
The overarching theme here is the absolute eradication of imbalance, or what the source calls al-muwazana.
Al-muwazana, meaning disproportion, right?
Yes. Disproportion. And it launches into a blistering critique of class divides. It treats the division of humanity into classes, masters and laborers, the elite and the working class, not just as an ethical failing, but as a fatal systemic bug.
A literal flaw in the civilizational source code.
Exactly. The text completely rejects the modern paternalistic idea of capitalists or feudal lords doing a favor for the working class.
Yeah, it views the framing of "we provide jobs for the poor laborers" as a grotesque distortion of reality.
It asks a devastating question, really. Who created this division in the first place?
Right.
Who decided that one group is the provider and the other is the recipient of favor?
Because the people claiming to be the benefactors are usually the ones doing zero physical labor.
Exactly. They are entirely dependent on the sweat and kinetic energy of the workers at the base of the pyramid.
Yet they sit at the apex, hoard the generated wealth, and act as if they are tossing scraps to a different species.
The system views this as the ultimate arrogance. You have extracted the value generated by the load-bearing pillars of the society, hoarded it, and then you demand gratitude when you return a fraction of it for their basic survival.
Right, and this is not charity.
No, it's theft. And it's theft that destabilizes the structural integrity of the whole society.
If the base of a pyramid is deliberately deprived of resources to cap the top with gold, the entire pyramid will eventually collapse under its own weight.
That is the inevitable consequence of al-muwazana.
And the source provides a fantastic, really grounded anecdote to illustrate what a balanced system actually looks like in practice.
Oh, the village economy.
Yes. It looks at the ancient village economy before modern hyper-capitalism kind of distorted the way we view labor. Walk us through that division of labor.
Okay, so in the traditional village economy described in the text, you had a strict division of labor, right? But it was based purely on function, not superiority.
Okay.
You had the farmer growing the crops, the cobbler making the shoes, the blacksmith forging the tools, the weaver making the clothes.
And none of them were considered existentially superior to the other.
No, they were all necessary cogs in a perfectly balanced engine. The farmer needed the blacksmith's plow just as much as the blacksmith needed the farmer's wheat.
Exactly. And the most crucial operational mechanism of this village was what happened at the harvest.
Yes.
When the harvest came in, the farmer didn't hoard all the grain in a silo, wait for the market price to peak during a famine, and then sell it back to the blacksmith at a massive premium.
Wait, but in modern capitalism, hoarding the grain to drive up the price is just considered smart business.
Right.
Why exactly does this ancient text view that as imbalance?
Because it starves the system. The text points out that in the balanced village, the farmer paid the craftsman first. Before anything else, the grain was distributed to the cobbler, the weaver, the blacksmith.
Why?
Because their labor had already been injected into the system to make the harvest possible in the first place.
The blacksmith's kinetic energy was already in the plow.
Precisely. And this distribution was not viewed as charity. The farmer was not patting himself on the back for being a great philanthropist.
Right. It was the required equilibrium of the system.
It was the settlement of systemic dues. Because if the farmer didn't pay the blacksmith couldn't eat.
He couldn't forge the ply for the next season.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the entire village, including the farmer, would starve the following year.
It was a closed-loop system of mutual survival. You maintain the equilibrium or you all fail the load test together.
Which brings us to a massive, massive paradigm shift in the text regarding how we view our obligations.
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it changes how we view our obligations to God versus our obligations to society.
This blew my mind. So wait, you're telling me all those massive cathedrals, temples, and rituals?
Mm-hmm.
This text argues that's completely missing the point.
It entirely deconstructs it.
Wow.
Usually, people think of the rights of God as a checklist of rituals you owe to the divine to keep God happy. You know, offerings, specific prayers, chanting.
Right.
But the text argues that there are no mystical rights of God in the sense that God needs anything from us.
Because the system operator is independent.
Yes. The term is Ghani independent, self-sufficient, requiring zero inputs from the agents.
Ghani.
God does not eat the crops. God does not need your money. God does not require your physical labor to exist.
Right. Think about it like an operating system. The core code doesn't need the user to feed it sandwiches.
Exactly.
So what are these rights then? If the system operator needs nothing, what is the system demanding?
What people traditionally call the rights of God are actually just the rights of humanity.
Oh, the Hukal Abad.
Yes, hukwa abad. Because the system operator needs nothing, the obligations demanded by the system are entirely for the maintenance of the agents within it.
So taxes, wealth distribution, social equity, fair wages, preventing exploitation, these are not just secular political issues.
No.
According to this text, they are the system's core requirements. They are the rights of God, translated into physical, sociological reality.
Yes. To ignore the socioeconomic equilibrium, to hoard wealth while your neighbor starves, to exploit a worker's labor, to create massive class imbalances, is to actively fail the assay.
It is not a minor moral failing that you can apologize for.
No, it is a structural violation of the constitution of the universe.
Wow.
You are introducing Anmawazna into the code, and the system will eventually apply the fire to burn that imbalance away.
It completely removes all the cheap sentimentality from religion and turns it into ruthless socioeconomic systems management.
It really does. You cannot pray your way out of a structural collapse if you are actively removing the load-bearing beams of your society through economic exploitation.
It is a mathematical view of morality.
Which leads us to the final mechanism, the law of requital.
The law of requital, or in the source language, mukafat amal.
Yes.
So if you violate this equilibrium, what's the penalty? Is it just karma? Divine judgment? Like, what is the requital in a systems engineering framework?
In this framework, requital is simply the final assay result.
Okay.
It is the printout from the diagnostic machine after the stress test is complete.
Right.
It is the inevitable mathematical reaction of the system to the inputs you provided, action and reaction.
It is not a judge banging a gavel in a courtroom. It is physics.
Exactly. But the text addresses a very funny, deeply rooted misunderstanding about this final assay.
Right, especially regarding the concept of meeting the maker or meeting God, which is referenced in verse 5.
Yes, the anecdote about Circe on the train.
I love this part. It perfectly captures how deeply we misunderstand the system. Set the scene for us.
Okay, so Circe was a famous 19th century rationalist and reformer. The story goes that he is sitting in an Indian railway carriage. It's hot, he's traveling, and he's completely focused on reading a book, just absorbed in his work.
Okay.
Across from him sits a debater, a traditionalist, or a mystic who desperately wants to argue about theology.
And this mystic is obsessed with this literal idea of meeting God face to face.
Right. He wants the mystical encounter, the unmasked vision in some ethereal vacuum.
Yeah.
He's pestering Circe, asking, don't you want to see the veil lifted? Don't you want to meet him? What will it be like to look upon his face?
And people really do think of it like that. We default to these anthropomorphic gods because it's comfortable.
It is. It's easier to imagine taking an elevator up to the clouds, the doors opening, and shaking hands with an old man on a throne than it is to face an absolute unyielding system of accountability.
So how does Circeid, and by extension the source text, correct this?
Circeid points to the absolute terrifying physics of the universe as the ultimate meeting.
The source uses cosmological verification to correct this completely.
Yes. It asks the mystic and the reader, what exactly are you looking for? A face behind a curtain. The text says that meeting the system or meeting God means observing the unbreakable physical laws of the universe.
It points to gravity.
Yes.
The text literally talks about gravity holding the heavens without visible pillars.
Exactly. It points to the precise, unyielding orbits of the sun and the moon.
Right. The sun doesn't decide to sleep in for an extra minute because it's feeling merciful.
If it did, the entire solar system's equilibrium would shatter.
The text is saying, you want to see the architect, look at the architecture. The veil is already lifted. The code is running right in front of your eyes.
So the meeting does not happen in a monastery or in a mystical trance or after you die in a vacuum.
Where does it happen?
The meeting happens on the battlefield of reality. You meet the system when you crash into its laws.
Right.
You meet the reality of gravity when you step off a cliff. You meet the reality of socioeconomic laws when your imbalanced, top-heavy society collapses into a violent revolution. That is the meeting.
Wow. And the consequences are precisely calibrated. The source references verse 7 here, which outlines what happens to those who enter the system and output constructive work.
This is the reward mechanism, and it's beautiful in its precision.
How so?
The text says that for those who engage with the system properly, who strive that jihada and do constructive work, the system will remit their bad deeds and reward them strictly based on the best of what they did.
Remits their bad deeds. In software terms, that sounds exactly like the system patching the bugs.
That is exactly what it is, because the system knows that the process of striving, the process of the assay, is inherently messy.
Yeah.
When you put ore into a 2,000-degree fire, there is smoke, there is cracking, there is dross. The human agent will make errors. We are fallible.
But if the core commitment is verified, if the trajectory of your kinetic energy is aligned with the equilibrium, the system automatically patches the bugs. It clears the dross.
Exactly. And it evaluates you based on the pure metal that is left. It rewards you based on the best of what you did.
The consequence is calibrated mathematically to your tested conduct, not to your declared identity.
Right. You don't get the reward just because you claimed the nationality or shouted the loudest.
You get the reward because your physical labor contributed to the harvest.
The fire sorts the material, and once sorted, the pure metal is utilized and rewarded for its proven operational capacity.
It is the ultimate meritocracy, utterly devoid of bias.
Yes.
So what does this all mean? Like, if we look at this blueprint today, we have to synthesize what we've learned. We have to look at what is permanent in this text and what is variable.
Well, the permanent principle is the absolute, unyielding core of this text.
Which is?
Belief, or any claim of identity, morality, or justice, without testing, is merely a claim. It is unverified data.
Right.
And life, the universe, the system, applies the test whether you consent to it or not. You cannot opt out of the assaying fire.
The only question is what the test reveals about your structural integrity.
Do you hold the weight or do you collapse? That is the permanence. But the variable is that the specific pressures change depending on the era.
Exactly. For the ancient Arabs, the test was a literal battlefield against the Persian Empire.
For the villagers, it was surviving the harvest through mutual cooperation and refusing to hoard.
So today, the fire might not look like a literal sword. The variables change.
Right. It might be an economic collapse. It might be an insidious social persecution. It might be the slow, grinding stress of a shifting global climate disrupting our supply chains.
But the assaying function of the universe is a constant.
And we must remember how the Surah opened its argument. It tells you up front that comfort is not where character is verified.
A bridge that has never had a truck drive over it cannot claim to be strong.
A society that has never faced scarcity cannot claim to be just.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave directly with you, the listener. Something to mull over as you look at your own life or as you look at the modern society around us. We have spent this deep dive establishing that systemic friction and adverse environments are the fire.
They are the metallurgical crucible that burns away the dross to reveal true operational capacity.
We have established that comfort is the enemy of verification. So look around.
Look at our hyper-connected, hyper-convenient world.
What modern conveniences, what unverified assumptions of progress are currently masking our structural weaknesses? Are we substituting actual physical resilience with cheap digital assertions of our values?
Are we mistaking the comfort of our current era for the strength of our character?
Because the system is absolute. The law of requital is running in the background. When the fire inevitably comes, when the economic, environmental, or social stress test is applied to our generation, what will be left of us?
Will we be revealed as the pure, tempered metal capable of bearing the load of civilization?
Or will we realize too late that we were just the dross all along? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.